was never done. So at some point, instead of just looking at you and your own attack surface, you start broadening your horizon and looking out. And after you looked at your sector and organizations like you to see what's hitting them, you move beyond the perimeter and you start looking usually initially at the technology, but later on actually realizing that there's an actor or a person behind all that adversarial malware that's being lobbed at you. And you start focusing also on the actor communications. And that's where our adversary and malware approach fits in. What we try and do, what we want to do, is help our customers support their decisions on the three layers of intelligence: the strategic, the operational, and the tactical. This is very important, and a key part about intelligence is that it helps support decisions. And we want to move beyond just the tactical. The tactical are examples of compromised accounts or IP addresses or URLs that host malware. That's very tactical information. It's very good. It's very valid. And we also call it actionable. You know what to do with it. But to gain a broader understanding of the whole ecosystem allows you to make more operational and strategic decisions, position yourselves better. And that is what we try and help our customers achieve. So I've talked a bit about the cyber underground. Also, there's a reason we call it the cyber underground. And I'll talk a bit about the cycle that powers so much of it. We try and avoid the term deep and dark web. I know that there's a lot of people talk about the deep and dark web. We also think that ice and icebergs, well, not icebergs as a whole, but certainly ice belongs in your drink. And icebergs basically have very little place in cyber threat intelligence. So we like to think of this as not so much a deep and dark web. Sounds very Hollywood. It's very magical. It's very spooky, and it is almost endless and limitless. And we think the truth is a bit different. It's actually not as big as you think, and it is fairly structured. And the reason is there's a lot of actors there that are trying to achieve something, and to achieve that, they need help. They need to communicate with others. They need to find like-minded individuals that will help them. And actually, in a very large and very dark and deep web, that becomes really difficult. So actually, it's rather self-organizing and structured in a way. And we basically distinguish three main pillars: products, services, and goods. So products are things like malware and phishing kits, web injects. They're kind of like the tools that you use to basically commit all your nefarious activities. The services are the bits that help with that, the intangibles: bulletproof hosting, exploit kits, bits you rent, etc. And the goods, but once you take your tools and your services and you apply them, you end up with goods. And the goods are the end result, and that's the part that you can buy, sell, trade, or pass off to someone else, where it starts to power another cycle or another value chain. And in this underground structure, call it a marketplace or an ecosystem, you have all kinds of actors with various motivations. Some of them are financial, others nation state, espionage, hacktivism, and they are buying, selling, discussing, planning, developing all these products, these services, and procuring or selling or goods. That is what we call the cyber underground. And in actual fact, it is fairly structured. And if you understand it, if you understand how it works, you can actually make better mitigate risks for your organization. Now, what I want to do in this presentation, kind of taking the temperature of the cyber underground, is do a kind of an overview, an overflight of some of the interesting developments that we see. Some of them are fairly recent. Some of them have been going on for a very long time, but I want to show how they interlock. And kind of the theme that I'm going to use to show how all these various moving parts click together and slot together is something which I call the MIA cycle. At its heart, it's the malware information and access cycle. You obtain some kind of information. In most cases, it'll be, for instance, account information. You use that to obtain some access to an otherwise closed off resource, for instance, your PC, and you use that access to install malware. You use the malware to steal more information, the cycle repeats. And the longer you do this, it's like a flywheel. The longer you do this, the better you get at it, and the more it starts to accelerate and gain momentum. Now, you can basically enter or leave this cycle at any point you want. You can buy or sell malware installations if you want to get started. You can buy or sell information, the credentials that gain the access. And you can actually buy and sell the access itself. And for all this buying, selling, acquiring, or trading, it's very handy that you have this structured cyber underground. And this cycle and its various entry and exit points are kind of like a value chain. They power a lot of what happens in the cyber underground. Now, are we solely concerned about kind of perpetuating this cycle? No, of course not. But once we have this core, we can use it to do other things. So instead of taking information like credentials, we can also steal data. We can use our access to steal data and try and monetize that data. Or if we have espionage as our motivation, we're not monetizing the data. The data is our end goal, our end objective, but we use this cycle to get to that data. If we have malware, we can install other malware. One prime example would be we can use malware to drop ransomware and then try and monetize the malware install that we have in that particular way. And finally, malware can serve as a platform. We can basically use that to move around an organization or a network and find other targets. This is kind of the MIA circle, the MIA cycle, and I'll be referring back to it over the course of my presentation. And this is kind of the map that shows you how these varying bits fit together. So let's start looking at the underground perspective, and let's start taking the temperature of the cyber underground. Now, as I've said, the elephant in the room is Corona. As you may have noticed, the world is undergoing a bit of a pandemic right now, and this certainly hasn't escaped the attention of the actors in the cyber underground. I think there'll be a couple of talks, and have been a couple of talks today already, about actors using or abusing Corona or COVID-19 to spread malware and for phishing campaigns, etc. And I'll start off with one that we caught, that came across our radar earlier. It's actually, I think, nicely ties into a report that Palo Alto's Unit 42 published just very recently. This one's actually from February this year, and you already see cyber actors using the Corona, it wasn't pandemic back then, the Corona crisis to spread malware. In this particular instance, it's very interesting. This is a spam email purporting to be from the World Health Organization, which is sent to recipients in the shipping industry, saying that there's a new procedure that all captains, all masters of a vessel must adhere to. It has a very handy Excel sheet attached to it. And what you do prior to coming into port, you have to, for a couple of days, take the temperature of the crew, record them in the Excel sheet, and then send that to the master of the harbor so he can see if anybody on this ship has Corona or not. It's very interesting because it almost sounds believable. And of course, what the actors are doing, because these are times when we deviate from normal procedure, they immediately use that to their advantage. Now, the Excel sheet in question, of course, actually has a complete other purpose. The purpose is to install malware. The malware that it installs is a malware family called Hawkeye. And Hawkeye is a category of malware called info stealer. What it will steal is passwords and anything you enter on the keyboard. And so the idea is to steal information. And the way this Excel sheet does that, it actually abuses a function in Microsoft Office called the equation editor. So it uses, and that the vulnerability in the equation editor is actually very old. It's a 3-year-old vulnerability. Now, malware-laden spam targeted at the shipping industry using a 3-year-old vulnerability. And the reason for this, the shipping industry, is probably because the actors read about the Maersk incident, where Maersk, a large shipping organization, got hit by ransomware. So there's every chance that the actors have read all the reporting there and thought, oh, hang on, the shipping industry, well, there's an industry that seems to be behind on patching a little. Let's try hitting them with this. So is this vulnerability actually old? You bet it's old. As a vulnerability, it's a very interesting one. If you've ever, it was actually contained in the least used bit of Microsoft Office, which is the equation editor. And not only that, but it was contained in a very old version of the equation editor, which normally only gets called upon if you find very old Office documents which actually had an equation in them. So I think this kind of qualifies for the absolutely least touched bit of code inside all of Microsoft Office. And is it old? Yes, it's more than 3 years old. And one of the things we do is we track vulnerabilities as they're being discussed in the underground. And the idea behind that is to help our customers prioritize patching. Patching is a massive challenge for a lot of organizations. And one of the things is there's so much to patch that people need to prioritize. And one way of looking at this is looking for state changes in actors discussing or being able to exploit certain vulnerabilities. So what we're looking at with this vulnerability intelligence dashboard is we're looking for vulnerabilities where something has changed, which means that actors may not be able to exploit this yesterday, but they will be tomorrow. So today is a good day to start patching. And this vulnerability, CVE 2017-11882, is that on that dashboard? No, it isn't. We do have a report for it, actually a historical report, because that one is 3 years old. It's not, nothing has changed in it. People have been able to exploit this one for a very long time. For instance, here we have a report about an actor offering an exploit pack that actually contains that particular, one of the vulnerabilities it's able to use is exactly that one, published on the 24th of November in 2017. Another one, an actor on hack forums offering another exploit kit for Word available, again with this vulnerability in it, dated in August 2018. So there's actually already several exploit kits using this particular vulnerability, and you actually basically should have patched this one by now. So if this isn't the one that we're watching for, what else, what is new, what is interesting, what is it that you should be keeping your eye on? Let's continue a little further on with our tour of the cyber underground. And the group that I wanted to talk about next is a group called TA505. They are an interesting group and certainly one to keep an eye on. I actually believe, looking at the agenda, there's another talk on them today. And TA505 is a fairly sophisticated group, and they're over here on the left. They're in the malware and the platform and the ransomware side of things. Their main aim is to infect machines with malware and then to monetize that in some way, either by moving through the organization moving through the organization and then stealing money, or in some cases, dropping ransomware. So this group is sophisticated. It's been around since 2014 at least. And up till very recently, they were well known for using the Neckers botnet for doing massive spam runs, which were dropping malware. There's a lot of research into them, especially by Proofpoint, obviously have a keen interest in anything to do with spam. And actually by their tally, a lot of the historical biggest mal spam runs in the world in successive years all came from TA505. I say used because actually earlier this year, a month ago, Microsoft launched an operation together with partners to take down the Neckers botnet. And it seems to have gone very quiet. So TA505 is probably looking for new ways to spread their malware. And interestingly enough, I know there's one talk today where they seem to be using some innovative new ways of getting malware onto machines. However, when they were still using spam messages, they had a variety of ways to kind of get the malware on the machine. Word documents or Office documents with macros in them, loaders, all kinds of small pieces of code that will reach out and download malware. Their main motivation is very simple. They want it's financial gain. And their targets are organizations all over the world. They have basically, we see them targeting countries and organizations basically across the globe. They're very sophisticated, they're very mature, and they have a very broad reach. The malware that they've actually used, so the eventual malware that gets dropped onto the machine, has been a mix. It's been banking malware, also info stealers, remote access toolkits, but also ransomware. And they've been around for so long, since 2014, that actually they've had to change the malware that they use, because sometimes the malware families they relied on simply disappeared, either because the author stopped supporting them, or they were taken down through international coordination between security companies and law enforcement, for instance. So they've been known to use Drydex, TrickBot, Shifu, Gagotech, JAF, Philadelphia, Global Imposter, and recently they've kind of returned to ransomware and started using Clop. And over on the right, we've got some, I just called some articles from the press from incidents that TA 505 was possibly involved in. So we've had the University of Maastricht in the Netherlands hit with a ransomware attack, Clop. They actually paid somewhere around 250,000 euros to get access to their infrastructure back, to basically get the university up and running again. And that's a good indicator that people are making serious money doing this. An article from that fount of knowledge and straight up reporting, the Register, about a French hospital that actually got hit with Clop ransomware. 6,000 PCs were locked in that particular incident in November of last year. That hospital allegedly was not paying the ransom. And then a recent one, Croatia's INA petrol station chain, actually energy company, got hit with ransomware. Again, it was Clop, so possibly TA 505 is implicated there as well. And that kind of brings us on to the next kind of trend, or I think is a kind of a continuous background noise, which is ransomware. Clop is certainly not the only group. One of the trends now with a number of groups is that they actually target organizations. They're not trying to encrypt individual PCs anymore. They want to encrypt entire networks, much like they did with the University of Maastricht, for instance, and then demand large ransoms to get an organization to pay up and basically get them access to their infrastructure back. Now, there's another trend that has recently popped up, and it's basically become kind of one started doing it, and then everybody else followed. They're now all building platforms to release data from any victim organizations which refuse to pay. So if we look at our French hospital in the previous example, they refuse to pay. Well, from now on, you run the chance that not only do you have to restore from backup, but they also might sell or publish dump your information on these platforms. I say platforms because each of them is coming up with their own. One of them is doing it on a file sharing platform, so basically a Pastebin-like platform. Others have set up their own blogs in Tor Onion sites. Maze was the first to do it, but Doppelganger, Megacortex, Nemtiv, and Revil, or so the wiki, have all followed suit. And basically, they achieve two goals with that. One, it's an extra motivation for afflicted organizations to pay up. And secondly, some of them are publishing it. Others are first offering the information for sale. And then once they've done monetizing it that way, then they'll publish it. This approach was predicted earlier, but now in the early 2020, we see all of these groups suddenly starting to do it. If we take our French hospital from just now as an example, there was another interesting development. I haven't put it on this slide because I don't think you should. You should definitely not rely on this. Maze, I think it was Maze, came out with a press release because yes, they called it a press release because ransomware groups now have press releases saying that they were stopping, they were no longer targeting, because of the corona pandemic, they would no longer target the health sector. Others said, well, we never targeted the health sector in the first place. I think we should take all these promises from cyber criminals with a slight grain of salt, because I think about 2 days after releasing this quote-unquote press release, Maze published information from a London clinic which had refused to pay up. So either someone in the group hadn't quite got the memo, or they have a very odd definition of what is the health industry. If you're in the health industry, you should definitely not be relying on the kindness of cyber criminals, but basically try and protect from this threat as best we can. best you can. So the next bit in the cycle that I want to talk about is access, buying or selling access to organizations, or buying or selling access to the data that organizations have. This was a trend that that really took off in 2019 and last year. When we started doing this, there were two actors that really were kind of the poster children of this new development. Started advertising this in 2019, but now we have, by my count, there's more than a dozen actors that are doing this. And we very regularly see actors in the underground offering for sale access to organizations. And it's large organizations, Fortune 100 companies get hit by this, not just smaller organizations. So FXMSP and the Joker are two actors in the underground that started doing this. Basically, what they abuse are existing methods that organizations have to give their employees remote access to company infrastructure. So things like remote desktop protocol, Citrix, OpenShares if you have them, VPNs, any other access protocols, they will try and abuse. What they do is quite often the initial way in is to get access to webmail. So that's the initial way in. They will try and gain access to webmail account for an employee, either through password reuse or because an info stealer has stolen credentials. And then from that, they'll pivot onto the RDP or the Citrix gateway, and that way they get access to the organization. And that basically is where their involvement ends. They will then sell that access, or they sell the data that account has access to. So if you have a Citrix account which has a desktop which has access to a bunch of network shares and folders, they will simply offer to sell that data, or just sell you the whole access as a whole. If they can't get any further, they will try and download the global address list. So if they have access to your webmail, your Office 365, or a hosted Exchange organization, they'll download the global address list and sell that on. And that is, of course, then used by others for targeted phishing campaigns, etc. Their targeting is actually opportunistic. So the organizations that get hit with this, they weren't specifically targeted. These actors are phishing with a very broad net, and whoever ends up unfortunate enough to be caught up in the net will be the one that they start to focus on and the access that they sell. You might remember the names FXMSP and the Joker because towards the end of 2019, a small New York intelligence company published a blog on them, which also caused both of the actors to kind of lay low and disappear off the face of the underground, as they didn't like this particular form of attention. So the next kind of part of the cycle is a cross between malware and information. It is the buying, selling, and acquiring of accounts. So kind of the credentials and the information. A lot of that is actually powered by malware. And a very popular category of malware, we mentioned it earlier with that spam email that we saw, Hawkeye, is in our info stealers. So info stealers are a category of malware that is basically focused on just stealing credentials. Or making it possible to gain access to credentials. There's a kind of important distinction. They're not just stealing credentials, they're stealing credentials, browser history, cookies, but also kind of the characteristics of the characteristics of your device, what type of browser, what brand of laptop, for instance, screen resolution, all these things, so that whoever buys these credentials is then able to emulate the victim as closely as possible, including, for instance, session cookies, usernames, passwords, etc., and gain access to accounts. One of the reasons to grab session cookies, for instance, if you've ever logged into a website that's protected with two-factor authentication, you usually get the option to trust this device, and then username and password is sufficient. From then on in, the website won't ask you for two-factor authentication for that device or that browser. That's usually based on cookies and a bunch of other characteristics of the browser that are recorded at that time. And so basically by stealing all of that, the info stealer, the actual actor, hopes to be able from a different device to log in and not get challenged for two-factor authentication. So these couple of families, the most popular ones are Azerworld, Predator, the Thief, and Hawkeye, actually are focused on doing just that. There's also a huge number of banking malware families, such as DanaBot and others, which also have this capability built in. Sometimes the actors running these banking malware botnets pivot away into becoming an info stealer. And sometimes they just basically, this is an extra little add-on, another way to monetize their bots. There are huge numbers of installs out there, and they're all stealing huge numbers of passwords to every single site that the victim is visiting. So that's one way of gaining access or grabbing information. Another is to simply try and brute force your way in. It's called account takeover. So now we're not actually using malware. What we're actually abusing is people's tendency to reuse passwords all over the place. And the other tendency that quite a lot of sites make you use your email address to log in, which basically means across a lot of different websites, your username is consistent. It's your email address. And sites say, well, that's not really a problem because the password will always be different, right? And that's where password reuse comes in. Now, password reuse on its own, really nice, but the kind of thing that made it all possible is the fact that there are long lists of leaked credentials out there. Websites have gotten hacked. They didn't store passwords in an encrypted form. So basically, there are huge collections of combinations of usernames and plain text passwords, billions of them. And here's where the password reuse comes in. If someone has used a password on a site, for instance, LinkedIn got hacked in 2012. That's a huge cache of passwords right there. If they also use that on their Yahoo webmail, same password, well, we could try logging in with that password on Yahoo. That's what account takeover looks like. Now, that sounds like a lot of hard work, and that's why a lot of, and basically that's what we have computers for. So this whole process of automating kind of trying all these passwords on different sites has been automated by a bunch of tools, account takeover tools. One of the most popular ones and well known is Sentry MBA. It's a tool for doing exactly that. It's fairly sophisticated, fairly nice, and it offers a couple of neat, quote unquote, neat functionalities. One is you can basically load it with a configuration on the target website that you're trying to gain access to. So basically, you need to tell it how does the login page work and what does a successful login look like. You also give it a list of proxies, and then as you're trying all your different passwords, you keep coming from different IP addresses. So in the logs, it won't look like one IP address is trying a million accounts. It looked like lots of IP addresses trying to log in, except there's a little issue with the username and password. So the tool itself is actually free, and you need the tool. You need these lists with usernames and passwords to try and for it to try. And if you want to, you need a list of proxies that it can route its traffic through. The config files are actually really for a specific website. For the website that you're trying to target, you'll need a config file. These are fairly easy to come by, and there's a bunch. If you Google, there's a bunch of them that you can download for fairly well-known websites that people want accounts on, stuff like Netflix, Spotify, PayPal, all those others. Of course, they will all be trying to detect the use of Sentry MBA and tools like it. If there's a specific site that you want to target, you can also get someone to write the config for you. Or you can even write it yourself. It's not massively difficult. But if the config you want isn't available for free, they're actually fairly cheap to get someone to write them for you. And if you want to know how to use Sentry MBA, there are many tutorials. And again, kind of a proof that it's not always the deep and dark web. YouTube has a fair amount of them. And that's certainly not deep, or certainly not the deep and dark web. So the cyber underground stretches all over, as it were. So we're taking and grabbing all these accounts. And we have basically all these bits of the cycle end up with us taking things. So where does it all go? Where does all this information and all this data go? And where does it eventually end up? I think this is the bit where the underground shops come in. Underground web shops that allow you to buy and sell any type of data, especially, for instance, credentials. So one of the things you have in the underground are credential shops. Fairly sophisticated looking ones. This is a very popular one called Slilp. As you see, very nice login screen, a username and a password. Note the fact that they're using captcha. Apparently, they, for some reason, are very well aware of the dangers of account takeover and brute forcing. So a lot of the stolen information and credentials often end up in these shops. And they're basically underground shops, selling anything from accounts to credit card data, and any other type of data that actors are looking to sell. You can buy them. You can either buy a list of accounts for one particular kind of web property that you're interested in, but there are also shops that allow you to buy one victim's almost entire online identity. Whatever takes your fancy, whatever you desire. So if you log into Slilp, here you can see the interface. As you can see, they're talking about refunds. A lot of the credentials that you buy come with a warranty or a guarantee. Same for credit cards, Amazon accounts, etc. If they don't work, just return them to the shop and they'll give you a new one. They have so many accounts they can actually refund or basically exchange those. Of course, so long as you play by the rules of the shops, there are certain restrictions on stuff that doesn't work, and then they won't refund you. So, by the way, it shows you the little interface for Slilp where you can select the particular shops, the particular sites that you're interested in. The green number in the middle is the amount of credentials they have in stock at that particular moment in time. As you can see, it's more than 50 million accounts. So we're kind of this is where the cycle comes complete, right? A lot of the data that ends up in these shops comes from our malware information access cycle. So for a lot of people, this is the end goal, monetize data through here. But for others, it's the start. They will actually buy data here and then use that to kick off their value chain. So for instance, if you're doing ransomware, you can go through these shops and look to see if they have any accounts for particular organizations that you're interested in. Did someone capture webmail credentials, for instance? And you can then use that to gain access to Citrix and possibly sell that on, and someone else uses that to drop ransomware. Now, basically, it's again, economies of scale. The really popular web properties, stuff like Amazon, PayPal, but also banks, they have their own dedicated listings. So basically, you can buy these in bulk. But you can also search for very niche and very specific accounts. And as I said, all of them come backed by a warranty. So that's kind of the cycle, and we're coming towards the end of the presentation. I do want to, and all of this, of course, is we now move towards kind of more the good news. We don't want to end on the note where we're saying, well, everything in the underground is terribly frightening. Actually, we talked about how actors are abusing COVID-19, but at the same time, COVID-19 is also affecting the underground. On the forums, we see many skimmers who are loudly and vociferously complaining that the number of cards that are being presented are way down, and so they are not skimming as many cards as they wanted to. At the same time, on many of the forums, we see actors discussing they're also very worried about their own health, and they're looking for advice. And the underground wouldn't be the underground if all kinds of other actors then jump in and offering all kinds of cures and good advice, or offering to help you be protected against COVID with all kinds of cures that don't work. Basically, the scammers are turning on other participants or actors in the underground. By the way, that's a continuous thing, by the way, but now they're just using COVID-19 for it. So at the end of the day, all the actors in the underground, please remember, they're only human, and they're affected by the same things as the rest of us. So I wanted to leave you with a couple of top tips. So what can you do to stay out of trouble and not fall victim to this kind of stuff? And this is not an exhaustive list, but just a couple of top tips. The first one, patch all the things, or patch as many things as you can. Again, what we see with a lot of organizations, if there is too much to patch, prioritization becomes an issue. And then you need to find ways to help you figure out which are the which patches should go on first. Another very, very important thing, put two-factor authentication on everything externally. You might even use it internally within the network as well for sensitive resources, but certainly anything that's external facing, that's internet accessible, you in this day and age, a username and a password. I hope, if you take anything away from what I've just been talking about, a username and a password is no longer sufficient to protect that. Also consider basically protecting it by requiring VPN access to access services like remote desktop protocol, etc. And basically, anything external, use a VPN. And then when you're using these things, make sure that you're logging, you log, first off, you log and hopefully also monitor your logs. That way you get alerted if anything goes wrong. But the ability, having logs when there's an incident is incredibly valuable. If we look at all these, for instance, going back to FXMSP and the Joker, instances where they have access to organization, the question becomes, did they take data? Did someone else access it? How much, if they took something, how much did they take? And if you have logs, maybe those can help you look back and answer those questions. Without them, you'll just have to wait and see what happens. And finally, use cyber threat intelligence to broaden your understanding. But of course, you're all going, he would say that, wouldn't he? But in all seriousness, I hope that this presentation has shown that having a broader understanding of what's out there and how the various parts all interlock helps you to make the right decisions on mitigating all the risks associated with that. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, I will say thank you very much.
Thank you, Maurits, and appreciate all those